Orpheus and Eurydice. "Stay away from the edge or you'll fall in and get wet," the nurse called out to the little boy in her charge. "Yes, Nanny," came the reply, and he ran off after his sister, playing tag among the stones. Nanny settled herself on a smooth piece of rock below the widely spreading branches of a leafy tree, put her back against its bark, and breathed a deep sigh. There was a splash and the sound of a little girl's laughter. Nanny looked up, and the boy was emerging from the stream, soaking wet all down his back and especially all over his bottom. Nanny pretended to cough to hide her laughter. "What did I tell you?" she chided him as she pulled off his wet tunic and rubbed him dry as best she could with her own skirts. The little boy looked down at his feet. "I don't remember," he mumbled. "You need to listen to your grown-ups," Nanny told him firmly, while his older sister stood by and nodded condescendingly. "When Mama or Papa or Nanny or Grandma tell you something, you need to listen to what they say." "I did, Nanny, but I forgot," said the boy. "You have to make sure you don't forget," said Nanny. "You have to think about what we've said to you and make sure you remember it." "I only fell in a little bit," complained the boy. "Maybe, but another time it might be something much worse," said Nanny. "I tell you what, why don't you sit out in the sunshine and dry off, and I'll tell you a story about a man who forgot what he was told to do and lost everything. Then maybe you'll realize how important it is to listen and remember." "Do I have to stay?" whined the little girl. "I didn't fall in the river." "It's a very famous love story," said Nanny encouragingly. "Oh, all right," said the girl with pretend reluctance. But her eyes had lit up and she settled herself happily on a large flat stone next to her brother. Nanny smiled and began her story. Once upon a time... Once upon a time there was a young couple, and it was their wedding day, Nanny's story began. The bride and groom had been preparing for 2 days, and they were ready for the bride's procession across the countryside from her own home to that of her new husband. The groom's name was Orpheus. He was a prince, the son of a king in a far northern kingdom, and some said his mother was a goddess, one of the muses themselves. Orpheus was the best lyre player in the world. When he played and sang, the music he created was so beautiful that it even charmed the birds and the beasts, and all the animals in the area would come and sit cheek to cheek with their natural enemies to listen to him. He could put the fiercest lion to sleep with a song. As a young man, he went on a great adventure at sea with many other ancient heroes, and he saved their lives when they had to sail past the wicked sirens. Those bird-clawed monsters tried to lure the men to their deaths with their sweet song, but Orpheus played so loudly and so much more beautifully than those monsters that he drowned them out, and the ship sailed past the Sirens' Island, the men unharmed. The bride's name was Eurydice, a beautiful young woman who was beloved of the Naiads and the Dryads, the spirits of the rivers and of the trees. They accompanied the young couple for their bridal procession, leading the maiden from her home in the countryside to the king's palace, where she would live as Orpheus' wife. Her gown was shot through with silver, and her girdle, necklace and bracelets were of bright gold. On her head she wore a crown of flowers, orchids, irises, tulips and lupins in red and blue and purple and white, and from it hung a bright yellow veil. The groom wore a matching flower crown and a long cloak. With one hand he led his bride by the wrist, and in the other he held tight to his lyre, which had been polished and restrung for the wedding feasts. They walked through the long grass by the river, the bride's gown lighting it up with shining silver, her delicate feet in sandals woven through with ribbons, stepping lightly across the spring earth. Orpheus' friends were following the bridal party, playing their own instruments, lyres and panpipes, aulos flutes and the clapping crotala. All the Dryads and Naiads were singing and dancing, and joy was in everyone's faces. Orpheus was caught up in the song, and could not bear to listen without singing and playing himself. And so he let go of Eurydice's wrist, and put his hands to his lyre, and took a deep breath to sing, plucking at the strings with well-practised fingers. But the song died in his mouth, for at that moment Eurydice cried out in pain and stopped walking. She bent over, holding her ankle, and as Orpheus turned to look at her, he saw a long brown form with triangular patterns on its back slithering away into the rocks and scrubland on the edge of the woods. But he could not watch it nor chase where it went, for his bride suddenly swooned at his feet. Her foot swelled and turned red and purple. As she fell backwards to the ground, she tore off her bright yellow wedding veil and looked to her Naiad friends, crying, "I feel dizzy!" They all crowded around her, washing her ankle with water from the river and with their tears, but she was fading away before their eyes. And while Orpheus stood there helpless, he watched her sigh her spirit out of her body with one last shuddering breath. "Poor Eurydice!" cried the little girl. "Was it a snake, Nanny?" asked the little boy, standing up and looking around him. "It was, child," said Nanny, "and that is why we always avoid the long grass when we are out for a walk, like today." She gestured to the thankfully snake-free scrubland around them and the bare rocks they sat on. "But just you keep an eye out as we walk along, anyway." Both children nodded solemnly. "You said this was a love story, Nanny," said the little girl, "but the couple are already half married and now the bride is dead." "Just you wait, child," said Nanny, "for it is a love story, but I never promised it would be a happy one." The girl looked disgruntled and shifted herself crossly, but the boy sat back down and both stayed to hear the rest of the story. The Naiads and the Dryads sent up the ritual wails of a funeral to the heavens, and Eurydice's body was taken, still and cold now, to the palace, where it was washed once again for burial. There were to be no wedding feasts, no dancing, no celebration. Instead, she was laid out in honour in the central hall of the palace, and all the Naiads and Dryads tore out their hair by her side for 2 days before taking her to be buried among the queens and princesses of that land. And all the while Orpheus stood silent, his lyre hanging limply by his side, his face streaked with wordless tears. Their mourning rituals completed, Eurydice's friends returned to their rivers and their trees. But Orpheus was inconsolable. Nothing would comfort him for the loss of his bride. Ladies and princesses came from far and wide to offer him their hand in marriage. His father and mother gave to him all the love they had, but nothing would do. He yearned for the veiled, flower-crowned beauty that he had lost. Lifting his lyre once again, he wandered the banks of the river singing songs of grief and of mourning, of loneliness and emptiness. He walked and walked through the long grass, hoping for that snake to come back for him and send him down to the halls of Hades to rejoin his beloved. But the snake was nowhere to be seen. So Orpheus made a decision. The children leaned in closer. He went on a journey far, far to the south, to the very tip of Greece. After long miles and weeks of walking, living by singing in the taverns for coins as his father the king refused to fund the journey, he came to a town called Taenarum. This place, it was said, was home to a gateway to the underworld itself. Orpheus made his way to a rocky promontory that jutted out into the sea, where he found a great marble statue of Poseidon guarding the entrance of a temple built into a cave in the rock. The god stood tall, a mantle draped carelessly across his body, with one hand on his hip while the other held aloft his great trident. He appeared to be looking out to sea, and Orpheus scurried underneath the idol's raised gaze, sure the god would not approve of his mission. Inside, the light from the mouth of the cave quickly faded, and Orpheus lighted a great torch, carrying it high in one hand, with his lyre wrapped under his other arm. As he stumbled down and down into the darkness, the air around him became close and hot. He heard a low rumble off to his right, a rolling growl that seemed to build to a crescendo, and suddenly, with a smell of meat and fur and mud, his path was blocked by a great black dog with 3 huge heads. "Kerberos!" cried both the children together. "That's right," said Nanny, nodding her head yes. "The great 3-headed dog that guards the underworld, snakes coiling and hissing around his neck, his eyes flashing, stood with teeth bared, drool pouring from his open jaws, guarding the gates to the land of the dead. His usual job was to prevent the dead souls from leaving, but he was not about to let a living man sneak past him in the other direction either." But Orpheus was prepared for him. What did he have with him, children? 2 little tongues stuck out of 2 little mouths as the children thought about this. "His lyre," said the girl after a few minutes. "His lyre," confirmed Nanny. "And what could he do with his lyre?" Both children thought again until the boy jumped up in delight. "He could charm the animals!" he cried. "That's right," said Nanny, smiling and motioning to the boy to sit back down. "He could charm the animals." And Kerberos was a dog. A giant, fearsome, 3-headed dog, but a dog nonetheless. So Orpheus simply dropped his torch, put his hands to his lyre, and sang his most gentle lullaby, his sweet voice soothing the great dog's temper while his hands moved delicately across the strings. Eventually, Kerberos was asleep. Orpheus had dropped his torch and was left in pitch blackness, so he had to feel his way carefully around the animal. He gently stroked the big dog's fur as he crept around the guard to resume his journey down the long, dark tunnel. After long hours in the dark, his sandaled feet suddenly felt wet, and with a splash he walked right into the shallows of a great wide river. "The Styx!" cried the little girl, bouncing up and down in excitement. "Yes, the river Styx," said Nanny. The ferryman will not take any soul across that great river without proper burial. But of course, Orpheus was not dead. He knew that if he could get himself across the river, he would not be turned away by the great king and queen of the underworld. After all, how could he be buried while still alive? So Orpheus strapped his lyre to his back and waded across the river, swimming carefully on his front when it got too deep. All around him he could hear the black frogs of the river of the dead croaking out their song. Brick-a-cack-ex, quacks, quacks, brick-a-cack-ex, quacks, quacks. Finally, Orpheus made it across the river. From there, he followed the eerie blue torches of the land of the dead along the road to the palace of the great king of the underworld, the god Hades, and his queen Persephone. The king and queen were in their throne room, a great temple whose fluted columns were painted not in red or green or blue, but silver. Hades sat proud and tall on his ebony throne, a sceptre in one hand and a great key in the other. Persephone stood by him, richly robed, a golden crown on her eternally young head, holding a sheaf of grain in honour of her divine mother Demeter. Orpheus approached the throne, his hands shaking so badly that the strings of his lyre quivered and a few notes of music spun around the room. He became aware of shadows all around him, shadows creeping up to the edges of the great hall, curling around the marble pillars and lurking in the shade of the blue flame torches. It was the souls of the dead, lost and empty, drawn to his music like moths to a flame. "O Lord and Lady of the underworld," said Orpheus, his voice catching on every word, "I come to beg of you a favour." "I do not think we need you to tell us what it is," replied the god in a big, booming voice. Then he laughed, and Orpheus could hear the echo of laughter all around him as the empty shades joined in. The only figure who remained stony silent was Persephone. "What makes you think," said Hades, leaning down and hissing into Orpheus' face, suddenly angry, "what makes you think that you are so special? Do you know how many thousands and thousands, millions of men and women beg me for that same favour every single second of every day? Do you?" Orpheus shook his head no, unable to speak. "And do you know how many times I have granted it?" said Hades. "Never," choked Orpheus. "So what makes you different?" demanded the god. Orpheus said nothing, but simply lifted his lyre and started to play. As his fingers worked their way across the strings, he sang too, not a funeral song, nor one of the songs of loss and grief that had been his only repertoire for so many months, but a song of love and joy. He sang of the beauty of human love, fragile and brief, and the even greater beauty of the eternal love of the gods, here nodding his head towards the royal couple. Hades smiled a little. Queen Persephone remained blank and unreadable. The souls of the dead pressed in, and a hissing sound announced the arrival of the Furies themselves, with snakes entwined in their hair. Orpheus played on for what seemed like eternity, for as long as his fingers and his voice would hold out. He saved just enough of his voice to finish off his song and end by addressing the great Lord of the Dead directly. "Lord Hades," he said, "all our souls are destined to be yours in the end. Here we are all bound, this is our final resting place, and you will ever reign the longest over the whole human race. My wife Eurydice too will be yours to command when she has lived a life. When we have been truly married, when she has borne me children, when she has raised our children and grandchildren and lived out her days in peace, then she will, inevitably, be yours. All I ask is a delay, that you return to her the future the snake in the grass stole from both of us. And if you refuse, I will stay here and you can have both of us." "Look," said the great god of the underworld, gesturing to the female monsters and their coiling snakes that had come to stand by his throne. "Even the Furies weep for you. No one has ever played such beautiful music down here in the depths. Very well, you may have your wife back. I will call for her." And so the Lord Hades called for Eurydice, and she came, limping, her dull yellow veil slipping across her eyes, her flower crown dishevelled. A smile lit up Orpheus' face, and he reached out eagerly to take back the wrist he wished he had never let go of. "Stop!" Queen Persephone spoke for the first time. "One condition I would demand of you, singer." She glanced towards her exalted husband, who nodded quietly. "What is it, my lady?" asked Orpheus. "I will do anything." "Marriage is built on trust," said the queen. "Every 6 months I return to my mother in the upper world, and my husband trusts that I will keep to our agreement and return to him when those 6 months are up. You too must show that you trust your wife. Do not take her wrist. Walk ahead of her, just that, through the darkness. Lead her back the way you came. Lead her out of this dark kingdom and back up to the light." "Of course, my lady," cried Orpheus, relieved at so simple a request. "That is not the condition," said Queen Persephone. "Turn around. Turn your back to your wife and face the way you came." Orpheus did so. "Now," said the queen, handing him a single blue-flamed torch, "you must not turn to look at her again until you have both emerged, whole and alive, from this land. When you climb out of the cave and the sunlight reaches both your faces, when you stand under the statue of Poseidon by the temple's doors, then you may turn and then you may take her by the hand. But until that moment, you must not turn around, you must not reach back, and you must not look at her. If you do, she will be returned to us here immediately, and there will be no second reprieve." Orpheus, dumbstruck, merely nodded yes, not looking at the king or queen for fear of accidentally catching a glimpse of Eurydice out of the corner of his eye. He simply walked forward into the darkness and trusted that she would follow him. It was a long, long walk through the dark, and Eurydice's feet made no sound, for she was not yet returned to the land of the living. Even when they stepped into the boat, Charon the ferryman glaring angrily at this arrogant fool who had bypassed him earlier, Orpheus could hear nothing of her movement, and she did not speak. He stood at the prow of the little boat, staring forward into the endless night, while she remained silent and still and not even breathing in the stern. At last, climbing out of the boat, Orpheus started the climb back up through the steep tunnel, up towards the surface and the light. He held his blue torch high above him, hoping to guide Eurydice by its light, his lyre strapped to his back. He crept around the still sleeping form of Kerberos, and assumed that she would also step gently around the huge, slumbering animal. Finally, Orpheus saw a light up ahead. Bright light, true daylight, not the eerie, cold light of the underworld. Up ahead, somewhere, the sun was shining. Its rays snuck into the front part of the cave temple, just touching down on the rock of the hollow, and Orpheus could see the feet of the great statue of Poseidon just coming into view. His heart leapt in his chest, his breath came thick and fast, and he leaped over the last few rocks and cried out in excitement, "Eurydice, we've done it!" And in his excitement, forgetting everything Queen Persephone had told him, he spun around to see his beautiful wife as she approached the last few steps up towards the doorway. "No!" cried both children at once. "Yes," said Nanny sadly. Although Orpheus himself stood on the very threshold between our world and the other, Eurydice had not yet reached the mouth of the cave. She remained still in the underworld, and so she would forever now. She looked up at her husband, and the veil flew off her face, tears running down her cheeks. "Farewell!" she cried, and she was pulled back into the darkness, flying downwards and disintegrating as she did so, her whole shape vanishing into smoke. Orpheus ranted and wailed and tried to follow, but it was no use. The gods of the underworld were looking out for him now. Charon patrolled the banks of the Styx, beating him over the head with his pole whenever he came near. The Lord Hades had the Furies fill all 6 ears of his pet Kerberos with wax, so the great dog was immune to Orpheus' charms, and he snarled and bit at him when he approached. Finally, Orpheus, like every other man who has ever lost a wife, was forced to admit that Eurydice was lost. Screaming his anguish out to the world on that cliff-top in the far south, under the distant eyes of Poseidon, he pulled out his lyre and smashed it to the ground. He never played a single note ever again. "So, children," said Nanny, "what is the moral of this story?" "Trust your wife," declared the little girl confidently. "That is an important moral, certainly," said Nanny. "Remember that in future, young man. Anything else?" The little boy thought hard. "Accept the word of the gods," he said tentatively. "Another good moral," said Nanny, nodding. "Any others?" "Understand that death is immovable," said the little girl sadly, thinking of her beloved puppy. "Yes, that is a good lesson too," said Nanny. "Anything else?" The little boy sighed in resignation. "Listen to instructions and remember them," he said grumpily. "Yes," said Nanny firmly. "When your grown-ups tell you something, listen and remember it. Protesting that you forgot will do you no good when the damage has already been done." The boy's clothes had dried and the sun was slowly sinking in the sky. Nanny pulled his tunic back over him and straightened the little girl's hair. "Come on home, children," she said. "It's time for bed." As they walked away, the little girl thought she saw a long brown shape slithering through the grass. But Nanny lifted her brother onto her shoulders and took the girl's hand, and the three of them stepped across the stones and bare rocks until they made it back to the road, and from there came safely home. The end. Hello, I'm Ed Harrisson. Welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling and discussing ancient, medieval and early modern ghost stories with episodes every 2 months. This one was a challenge because it's probably one of the most famous stories I've done. It was quite hard to find a way of retelling it in an interesting way while also kind of keeping what makes what makes the story the story. I'm very fond of a lot of modern retellings of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, things like the French film Orpheus from the 1940s. Moulin Rouge is a retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice, and some of those are great and really effective, but I wanted to do this with its kind of original, or, with a mythical ancient Greek setting, and that meant doing it kind of straight, which was quite difficult. In the end, as I thought about it, I thought, well, this is a very fairy tale-like story. So I decided to make it a fairy tale told to children by their nurse or nanny. And that's actually how Plato mentions Greek myths were often passed down, that they would learn them as children from their nurses and their nannies. My main source was Virgil Georgics, book 4, and Virgil specifically says Orpheus looked back because he forgot the instruction. So I went with kind of a moral of not forgetting things you've been told. Stories to teach children lessons are obviously also a very long-standing ancient Greek tradition. That's what Aesop's fables are. Virgil also blames Persephone, so I made it Persephone who asks for the condition in the first place. And I also used Ovid's Metamorphoses. I don't like Ovid very much. He writes very beautiful Latin, but he writes often about men and women in a way I don't like. But he does include more detail than Virgil, so I couldn't really avoid Ovid. Virgil's version is slightly older, and I like Virgil more, but I had to use both of them to get some of the detail, especially the detail of it being their wedding day. And I also left out Eurydice being chased by a satyr, which sounds like something Ovid would write, but was actually Virgil in this case. I also drew on all sorts of other bits and pieces, various Greek sources. The story of Orpheus sailing with Jason and the Argonauts and drowning out the music of the sirens is from Apollonius Rhodius' Argonautica, book 4. The description of the statue of Poseidon I described based on a statue, the Poseidon of Melos, which is in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and then the description of the area from Pausanias' description of Greece. The frogs in the river Styx are from Aristophanes' comedy play Frogs, and they do say brekkekekex quacks quacks. They don't say ribbit ribbit. This is because there's actually only one frog in the world that says ribbit ribbit, and it's American. Other frogs from around the world make varying different croak-type sounds, and Aristophanes writes out the croaking of the frogs in the play Frogs, which is a comedy about Dionysus going down to the underworld. And the chorus are the frogs who live in the river Styx, and they all say brekkekekex quacks quacks. So I made sure to use that for the croaking frogs. The cave near Taenarus with the temple and the statue is a real place in the southern Peloponnese described by Pausanias, and it was also thought of as one of the conventional entrances to the underworld in Greek mythology. Orpheus is sometimes listed as the son of Apollo, but his father is usually a mythical Thracian king called Oeagrus. So Thrace is further north, covers a large area, including parts of Macedonia, Bulgaria, and northern Greece. His mother is often said to be the muse of epic poetry, Calliope, although there are various different versions with different mothers. And if you're interested in Greek musical instruments, do check out my video on my YouTube channel, Classical JG, which I made last summer with the musical reenactment group Here Be Flagons on myth and music. I added some details myself, the detail about Orpheus letting Eurydice go at the wedding when he lets go of her wrist. I wanted to explain why he'd let go of her and just sort of add to his guilt and horror and so on. And I wanted to add a bit to his character and his love of music. I also added him charming Kerberos to sleep. Kerberos usually doesn't stop people coming into the underworld. He only stops them leaving. But I thought that would be a more interesting scene if he had to charm him to sleep. And since it's already in the mythology that Orpheus can charm animals, that just seemed to make sense. And the torches burning blue is my idea as well, just for a bit of atmosphere. I based the snake that kills Eurydice on the horned viper, which is one of the most venomous snakes in Europe and can be found in Greece. So I looked up the symptoms of horned viper venom. And I used a Greek vase from the mid-4th century BCE for the description of Hades and Persephone and their throne room. Ancient temples weren't white, but the pot is only in black, white, and red because of the way it's made. Those are the only colours available. And the kind of temple thing that it looks like they're in the underworld looks white on the pot. So I thought, well, I'm not going to make it white because they're not white, and that's a common misconception, but I want to use this pot, so that's why I decided they were going to be painted silver instead. And I also looked at other common depictions of Hades and Persephone to draw on the descriptions of them as well. I mentioned the sirens briefly, which may have been surprising to anyone who didn't realise that in ancient Greek mythology they did not look like mermaids. Apollonius Rhodius describes them as sometimes like birds and sometimes like maids, young women. Homer's Odyssey doesn't describe their physical appearance, but just describes what they do, and on vases they are usually depicted as bird-like, and they live on an island, not in the water. They're not sitting like on a rock coming up from the water, they are on an island specifically. They often have an association with funerals as well. But if anyone was confused by the description of the sirens, that's why. Different ancient Greek city-states had different traditions around weddings. Sparta in particular might have been quite different. Sparta had quite different customs to a lot of the others in many cases. But we can get a broad idea of some of the most common customs from a variety of sources. The bridegroom would usually be about 28 to 32, and the bride about 12 to 15. Basically, girls would be married once they started to menstruate. This is to ensure that there is absolutely no chance that they could have had anybody else's babies. Some city-states like Athens also practiced quite heavy seclusion for more wealthy women who spent most of their time in their homes or walking to the well or going out for religious festivals. But again, that would depend on the individual city-state. Spartan women went outside a lot more often. Marriage ceremonies would take place over 3 days. The first day, the proaulia, was a day of preparation, and the bride would make sacrifices to the virgin goddess Artemis because she's about to give up her virginity. The main wedding ceremony took place on the second day, the day of the gamos, wedding. The bride would be ritually bathed and dressed. The archaic poet Hesiod describes the mythological character Pandora wearing silvery clothing, a girdle, jewellery and a flower crown in one poem, and a golden headband in another poem. So I based my description of Eurydice's outfit on that. Greek brides were also veiled. In Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Iphigenia's bridal outfit is described as krokos, saffron or yellow. So I've made the veil yellow, which also fits with Roman flame-coloured wedding veils, which would have been yellow, orange or red. The groom wore a cloak and he also had a garland on his head. There was a feast, probably at the bride's home, and then the bride was led by the hand or wrist to the groom's home in a wedding procession. Sometimes they might have gone in a small cart, especially presumably if they lived far apart, but most of the vases that show a wedding procession show the groom holding the bride's wrist and leading her on foot. In Rome, in Latin, the word for a man to get married was actually to lead a wife. So the idea of the man leading his new wife home is very common to both cultures. And we still have the phrase to take someone's hand in marriage. In modern Western wedding ceremonies, it's more associated with kind of taking each other's hands. But it probably originates in this kind of tradition where in ancient Greece and Rome, the groom is literally taking the bride's hand or wrist to lead her off. The bride would be ritually accepted into the groom's home, sometimes by his mother holding 2 torches, and she would be given ripe fruit to eat. This may have been a reference to Persephone eating pomegranate seeds and being stuck in the underworld, which I had hoped to try and squeeze a reference to into the story, but there just wasn't room, and I'd already squeezed references to 6 different Greek myths in there, so I had to leave it out. The marriage would be consummated that evening, and then the third day, the epaulia, was for the giving of gifts and for more feasts and dancing, and the bride would cook for the groom and his male relatives. Ancient Greek funerals were also in 3 parts, like weddings. The prothesis was the laying out of the body, and there would be ritual wailing, and women would pull out their hair in a ritual way. And you can see this on Greek vases, images of mourners next to the body, female mourners, and you can see them pulling out strands of hair, in some cases from under their veils. And they would carry out these ritual mourning activities. The prothesis lasted 2 days, and then it would be followed by the ekphora, the funeral procession, and then the burial or cremation, depending on what is fashionable at the time and the desire of the deceased or their family. If you would like to check out my sources, Virgil's Georgics, Ovid's Metamorphoses are both available, translated by A.S. Klein at poetryandtranslation.com, and I thoroughly recommend those translations. I found a few really interesting websites that I was able to use when I was putting this one together. So womeninantiquity.wordpress.com has an article on the ancient Greek wedding ceremony and another one on bridal attire in Greece and Rome. I used a report on spring flowers in the Peloponnese from www.medpag.org. It was a bursary report by the looks of things. I have no idea what that was, but it was a description, a very detailed description by some people who had been to the Peloponnese in the spring of the flowers, complete with their Latin names. It took me ages to work out what their actual regular names were. I used a resource from the Metropolitan Museum of New York on death, burial, and the afterlife in ancient Greece. And I also found a page from the Marlborough Science Academy, which mentioned how long the laying out was. I had a quick look on Wikipedia on the Poseidon of Melos, which I have seen in real life at the museum, but just to remind myself of the details. And I had a look at the Oxford Classical Dictionary online for images of Hades and Persephone. So I feel like that might have been a slightly shorter discussion than usual. I don't know, but hopefully the information on weddings was interesting anyway. I am delighted to say that the book version of this podcast, my first collection, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, is now available on a variety of platforms in paperback and ebook, including Kobo, Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, Fable, Amazon, a whole bunch of others I can't remember. But anyway, it's on many platforms. And the second volume is coming out at the end of this month and will feature this story. This is one of the stories going into Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece. Like the first volume, that will be a collection of stories from the podcast, plus one book exclusive. There are slightly fewer stories. There's going to be 10 stories in this collection, but some of them are slightly longer, so it should be about the same length. I have a monthly newsletter where I share book news and historical fun facts, which you can subscribe to on Substack. Creepy Classics has its own YouTube channel, which is just another place to listen to the podcast, but I also have a separate YouTube channel called Classical JG, where I cover spooky stuff, history and literature and folklore and folk practices relating to the spooky and the weird and the wonderful. New videos going up weekly there. Thank you so much for listening. I am hoping to have a look at a Robin Hood story in 2 months' time. That will be June, so I will see you there. And until next time, bye! Creepy Classics was written and performed by Ed Harrisson. Music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson with vocals by Olivia Knops. It was produced by Ed Harrisson with assistance from Birmingham Newman University.